Okay, folks, it's about 2 minutes past the hour. Again, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Eric. I'm the CEO of the Blockchain Supply Chain Association, your industry association to better understand the importance of emerging technologies such as blockchain, kind of says it in the name there, for the supply chain world. We are here today with very special guest, Matthew Nelson, CEO of Arivu. Who will talk to us about a very important topic, net zero supply chains. A lot of stuff to cover today. We will record the session. We do have slides to share after the event. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button. So we'll monitor that and keep some time at the end for your questions. So with that, Matthew, I will hand over the microphone to you and stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to do today is just kind of take our viewers on a journey, knitting together some pieces of the sustainability puzzle as it relates to supply chains and our overall transition toward net zero. So just a very brief background on myself. My professional background, I come from a history of financial risk management advisory in banking and capital market space, a number of years in technology and operations, followed by more in-depth banking and investment management experience, but in recent years have gotten much closer to technology and bringing data to life. And I'm one of the co-founders of Arivu. So let me share my screen here and present. Here we go. So what I'd like to do is just take us through very brief introduction to Arivu and what we do, what we stand for, but then step into a macro context for looking at carbon emissions overall, the industry and businesses' response to the current climate crisis that we're facing.
Hey, Matthew, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't think we can see your screen at the moment.
Oh, right. Excuse me. Thank you for that.
We want your flashy logo to be front and center, don't we?
Absolutely. Here we go.
Awesome. Perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, sorry about that. So again, just taking us through the macro context of the emissions situation, how business has been responding, and very importantly, what the regulatory response is, and just a few key points on major regulatory change that's impacting supply chains. And then looking at the net zero transition and what this means from a procurement perspective. Of course, then, as we're all probably painfully aware, there are many complications in quantifying and identifying carbon footprints, looking at carbon debits and credits, and then how to engage supply chains in our challenge to effectively report our sustainability and communicate properly with our corporate stakeholders. So we'll finish that off with a look at some of the carbon market headlines, which really emphasizes some of the points that I'll be raising through this conversation. But I do want it to be a conversation, and so any viewers that have some questions, please pop those into the chat, and we'll get those covered as we go through this. So very briefly on Arivu. First of all, Arivu it's a Tamil word that means the methodical acquisition of knowledge. Now, we are a technology company. We are not consultants, and our purpose is to really help underpin the transition to a sustainable future with trust by making evidencing and reporting of sustainability easy and socially meaningful. So we're on a mission to provide every company on the planet with a trusted way to own, prove, and share their sustainability transition. So you can find us at arivu.io, or you can follow us on LinkedIn. So now let's step back to the macro context. And I think it's important to keep the conversation actually looking at some of the key numbers. Since the Industrial Revolution, the carbon emissions that we have been producing have been skyrocketing. And by 2019, they had reached 41 gigatons of CO2 per year. Now, to be very clear, this is greenhouse gas emissions translated into carbon as a base currency for how we think about our overall pollution emissions into the environment. What we're looking at here is some McKinsey research that indicates under the Paris Agreement, if we were to stick to a 1.5 degree temperature increase maximum over up to 2050, what do our emissions profile need to look like to reach net zero emissions versus our current trajectory, which is estimated at 3 degrees, which is this light gray number. The bottom line here is that there is an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to curb our carbon emissions and our pollution to bring us down to net zero by 2050. Now, where is all this carbon coming from? This is a very complex graphic, but it's really an important way of visualizing which business activities and life activities we carry out that are generating the largest carbon footprint and carbon emissions for us. And you can see that 73.2% is coming from energy, and the other large contributor is agriculture, forestry, and land use. So if we unpack that a minute, one of the when you talk to corporates in the market today, larger corporates are really taking a focus on where they can abate their carbon emissions and reduce those footprints. And there's a huge focus on energy use in buildings. You see down here at the bottom that totals 17.5%, and it is split between commercial and residential buildings. But the real indicator here is that the efficiency of our use of energy in the built environment is just the inefficiency of our energy use is just a massive problem for our overall carbon emissions. Of course, transportation plays a factor, and here is a really interesting statistic. Recently at a conference with the head of Formula E, the electronic Formula One, the electric vehicle Formula One Racing Association, indicated that they're achieving a 95% conversion ratio of energy to wheel between those battery-powered cars, comparing that to combustion engine vehicles that are really struggle to reach 30% efficiency. So it's just a really interesting statistic indicator of just how inefficient our current energy consumption is in those two areas. A couple of other kind of interesting statistics, and also very important from a supply chain and procurement perspective, is around agriculture and land use, where there are another interesting statistic from the Vera certification body and research. The methane emissions from rice paddies have been estimated at 8 to 12% of the overall agricultural carbon emissions. And this is simply to do with the decaying organic waste in rice paddies. So some very interesting, just on those touch points that I mentioned, very interesting technologies that can be applied and abatement activities that can be applied that have a massive impact on our carbon emissions. So, so what's been the business response to this issue? First of all, it has been positive from a messaging perspective. And following COP26, and according to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, we've seen over 130 trillion in private capital that's been pledged to reach net zero by 2050. And so this is a significant pledge toward the right goal and the right target. And when my team and I first started working in the sustainability space, we were expecting that a lot of the activity behind transition to net zero and drives to reduce carbon would be regulatorily driven. But in fact, what we're finding is that companies are actually being driven by their customer and investor expectations. And so, and this goes well beyond the 130 trillion of private capital. These are generally the large banks, large corporates, and fund managers. But we see very much grassroots interest in what we're calling a race to the top. Now, regulators are not standing still, far from it. And there is an absolute myriad of regulations and reporting frameworks that are in place. As a matter of fact, there's over 40 different sustainability and ESG reporting frameworks in effect around the world today. Now, a lot of those are consolidating, and we're seeing an enormous amount of change and moves towards standardization. But I wanted to highlight here two of those regulations, which are really having an impact on procurement, supply chains, and you'll see in a few minutes why. The first of these is the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, this is it came out of COP26. It was an initiative by the International Financial Reporting Standards Board, so IFRS is for it is the global standard for financial reporting for corporates, and it's to address all of the local generally accepted accounting standards in different jurisdictions. Creates a consistent common global reporting framework. The ISSB is seeking to do the same thing for the sustainability reporting at a corporate level, so that investors, readers of financial reporting for a corporate can recognize and easily understand the sustainability initiatives and carbon footprint and the investments and transition to net zero that company is taking for their investment decision making. And so there should be no so the implications of this type of a reporting standard cannot be underestimated, and the knock-on effects are really significant. The second piece of regulation is one that has come out of the European Union, and this is it's called the taxonomy regulation, and it was originally created to help channel financial investment into sustainable business activities and operations. And what it does is it takes a look at business activities and the carbon intensity of business activities. And so if you think about the industries, the standard industry codes, the SIC codes, or in Europe, the NACE codes, which are standard classifications of business activity. Those have been, under the taxonomy regulation, broken down into identified carbon intensity of those to provide a clear framework around the whole concept of sustainability and really helping define when a company is operating sustainably or whether it's being environmentally friendly based on those business activities. Now, this comes back really important to when we talk about supply chains in just a moment. But overall, important takeaways from this regulatory response are that the ISSB is impacting how your investors are assessing your sustainability strategies and practices. And the taxonomy regulation is impacting the cost, your cost of capital and your availability of capital in your investments and in your CapEx spend. So, and that we're seeing multiple examples of in banks across Europe in particular. And so really significant impacts from a regulatory perspective. Now, that's an awful lot of information to digest, but you might be asking, what does all of this mean for procurement? And I think it's safe to say that all roads lead to a net zero transition. Now, this is further McKinsey analysis that really starts breaking down the path to net zero 2050 based on annual reductions in carbon output. Notice the middle point here, 2030. That's the middle of the chart. In 2030, we need to have achieved a reduction of over half, the total combined output of carbon globally. That's 7 years away, and that step is absolutely huge, but it's also absolutely imperative if we are to further go forward to reach net zero 2050. I'll kind of pause there for a moment. And Ray or Eric, are there any questions that have come through yet?
Actually, we have two, Matthew. One from Sarah, who's asking if you have updated numbers. You were showing a couple of different graphics on world temperatures, I think, when the picture when the question came in from Sarah, showing 2020 emissions. So do you have any current numbers worldwide?
No, that's a great question, and apologies for having to use a slightly dated visual. So we can certainly find this. It was I chose this in order to present the magnitude of the different carbon emissions. So I'm afraid I don't, but I can actually, I'd be happy to have a look and put something into a response after.
And we can share that after the event as well. If we do find the link, we can send that over to the email.
Happy to do that.
And a quick other question from John, who's asking, what about carbon fraud?
We're going to get to that one, and it's really significant. It is a big problem. And so, I mean, carbon fraud sits on both sides of the fence. So first of all, there will be carbon fraud from a corporate's reporting perspective, which is greenwashing and presenting data and information which makes you appear more sustainable, environmentally friendly than you actually are. Proper greenwashing from the corporate perspective. There's also carbon fraud on the carbon credit side. And if you'll bear with me a moment, I'll take you through some of the aspects of carbon credits which are really important. And it's actually a good segue into the other messages about this chart. So the blue parts of the bar chart are global carbon emissions. The red portions are the required negative emissions, or carbon capture and sequestration, which is required to offset those parts of our carbon footprint, or those carbon emissions which we're not able to negate or abate. So on this journey, it is important that we build a carbon sequestration, whether those be natural climate solutions like reforestation or regenerative agriculture, or carbon sinks from natural sources. Or if we, combined in that as well, are going to be things like carbon capture and sequestration technologies, where we're capturing carbon at the source, at the plant flue, or at the tailpipe of the vehicle. Now, there is a very controversial, this is a controversial space, without question. And if you can imagine 7 years to reduce our carbon output by half, there is no shortage of disruption. And this journey will be fraught with change and challenge. So there's definitely carbon fraud to be paid attention to on all sides. So for procurement, one of the most important things is that actually here, studies have indicated that Scope 3 emissions, which are those emissions from upstream activities to your business, which is your procurement of product and service in order to generate your own product or service for your customers, and as well as the downstream activities, post-sale to your customers, the usage and eventual final destruction or disposal of the end of life of the product. Those two sides of your business are the Scope 3, and they can equate to up to 65 to 95% of your organization's carbon footprint, which all has to be reported. So, this is where we really start opening the complexity can of worms in how we engage and acquire the data from these parties, and then go about quantifying what that Scope 3 carbon footprint really is. A quick note on carbon debits and carbon credits and quantification, both at a product and a corporate level. So first of all, when we think about your company and its Scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions. So quick reminder, Scope 1 is your direct emissions from your operations, your plant and equipment, etc. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from the energy and wastewater used in your operations. So here we're talking about the extent of your renewable energy use and natural gas usage, etc. What we're indicating in this graph is that your different categories and subcategories and specific quantifications of your emission, and those quantifications result in a ton of CO2 equivalent for that activity. These have to be these are quantified typically using carbon accounting tools which follow the greenhouse gas protocol methodology, which is a series of inputs and emission factors, which then calculate the equivalent carbon tons that from that input. Now, what we're showing here as well is on the carbon credit side, there are specific needs to offset any residual that you're not able to abate and remove. You need to be offsetting that with your carbon credits, but those credits should be appropriate to your business operations. And just a quick example there is if you're using electricity in a facility in northern Germany, you should be offsetting that with wind or solar credits generated in northern Germany, rather than with trees planted in Indonesia. And we have a number of conversations with corporates where even very small businesses, companies are wanting, first of all, to have a very meaningful quantification of their footprint and what they're doing to abate that footprint and doing their part. And that meaningful conversation they want to have with their customers. And so they're looking for impactful stories that they can tell, and they want to show what are the credits that they're buying and how they're using them, and so that they can tell those impactful stories to their customers. A really interesting point. So time and again, we see corporates being very specific about the footprint, their footprint, both at a corporate and at a product level. An example at a product level is Adidas's recent consumer tags on a pair of trainers that indicate the kilos of carbon used in the manufacture from the fabric and the rubber, the kilos used in the packaging, the kilos used in the shipping, and the kilos anticipated for the end of life of that product. So really interesting quantification, articulation of the carbon debits of that product for a consumer to easily understand. So again, we see companies wanting to have appropriate offsets for their footprints, but we're actually doing a lot of work with different carbon projects, and these are in the voluntary carbon space. And a really big trend here is that these carbon projects, the carbon credits are being snapped off the shelf. The demand is extraordinarily high, and it is difficult, increasingly difficult, to get your hands on carbon credits. However, given the amount of greenwashing that is abundantly obvious in many many headlines and various companies, these projects are starting to get very selective about to whom they sell their credits, and so much so that there is some players in the market are putting together screening criteria where they need to know whichever company is buying the credit, what are you using it for? Do you have a net zero strategy? Where are you on that strategy? How much carbon have you abated over the past? So that they know that their very hard-earned and precious carbon credits are going to a proper cause. And that required transparency from top to bottom in the carbon value chain is a really interesting space, and we're just seeing the demand for that transparency on both sides of the demand and supply equation. So again, we come back to so what does this mean for supply chains, and how can we actually engage the supply chains? I think there's a my apologies. I do want to step back here and talk a little bit more about the carbon credits. It comes back to the carbon fraud point, and again, in this very nascent and fast moving and fast evolving marketplace, there are a number of initiatives to instill more discipline and a principles-based approach to carbon projects. One of these is the core carbon principles, and there are 10 of them. And I'll touch on a couple of these that are just really important. First, the first important principle is the additionality. And this is a concept that a carbon credit, a ton of carbon credit, should be an additional sequestration, and it's debatable whether it's avoidance of carbon emission, but a sequestration. So the principle of additionality is important. The project needs to be providing activity information about how it's mitigating carbon and how it's sequestering it. They need to ensure that there's no double counting of that single certificate that's going out. They need to also ensure that the sequestration is permanent. Now, This becomes really difficult in a reforestation, afforestation project, where the forests, which have been developed, grown, can be impacted by disease or forest fire, just like in California, where their carbon credit system, the buffer pool of credits issued on their forest is 95% wiped out because of the recent forest fires. And so it creates some really interesting dynamics around how you risk manage your investment in those carbon credits and portfolio manage those carbon credits going forward. And of course, the need to retire those. The retirement is really important for carbon projects are wanting their certified carbon credits to be immediately retired by the buyer to avoid being traded on the open market, arbitrage, and not used for investment speculative purposes, but properly used by companies that want to use them. There's a number of other principles that are behind the core carbon principles, but it's just again, just an indication of just how fast moving this space really is. And so now we turn back to how can we engage our suppliers? And I think there is no silver bullet here. And there is a combination of using engaging technologies to reach out and source and collate this information. There's the question of how to ensure that whoever's providing that information, your suppliers, are able to efficiently and rapidly update and curate that information over time. But there can be some real differences in the relationship that companies have with their suppliers, and which of course impact your ability to reach out at any point with new sets of questionnaires and get a reliable and consistent response. But one of the things, and this is what we're looking at here, is I found an absolutely wonderful initiative by it's called the Chancery Lane Project, based here in London, and it's this is about getting climate-related clauses into your supplier agreements. Now, this organization, it has been founded by a number of law firms, huge collaboration on a global basis, and they have come up with, at the moment, it's 119 different legal clauses for commercial contracts. And this set, there's 27, which are specific to supply chain. And I encourage you to have a look at it. It is just a very interesting way to take standardized language and turn it into and embed that into your relationship with your suppliers. Now, of course, you still have issues with kind of tier 3, 4, and 5 suppliers, but starting to embed this type of language and commercial arrangement into your agreements can actually be a highly effective way to start either implementing information clauses, etc., and get that engagement up, because you're not going to be alone in asking these companies for this information. And that's one of the things that is interesting. Coming back to the Sustainability Standards Board reporting requirements for those large listed global corporates, since it contains scope 3, they therefore need to ask their thousands and thousands of suppliers, many of whom are small to medium-sized businesses, for their information, their scope 1, 2, and 3 information. So the initiatives are coming from larger corporates, and the regulations are aimed initially at the large corporates, but the impact is far and wide. And so the sooner and the faster that we all get equipped and speaking the same language. And this is not a small task, as we've seen, but the faster we can get to having those emissions by 2030, and hopefully moving swiftly forward to net zero in 2050. I kind of wanted to kind of round it off with some headlines, and it was quite extraordinary. These are today's headlines from carbonpulse.com, and every single one is touches on the points that we've been discussing here. Now, just bear in mind that the carbonpulse.com is it's a forum for the carbon markets, and therefore heavily focused on voluntary carbon markets. But have a look here that Gabon is they are about to offer 90 million forest protection credits coming onto the voluntary carbon market. And I mentioned there's high demand, and bidders are emerging that are paying well above market rates for those units. Just a very interesting side note here. Was at the Reuters Impact Conference last week, and Mo Ibrahim of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, as well as the president of the African Development Bank, were speaking. And some interesting facts that I wasn't aware of, that Africa contributes as a continent, 3.3% of the world's carbon. However, there is a forest in the Congo Basin which alone sequesters and removes 4% of the world's carbon each year. On that basis alone, one could say Africa is already net negative. In addition, there's already, out of the 54 countries that make up the African continent, 21 of those countries have their primary source of energy as renewable: wind, solar, or hydro. So a very interesting contrast to the whole north-south divide in the carbon debate, but just some really interesting interesting data points that come out of there. Back to our topic here. So huge issuance is underway, and the London Stock Exchange is setting out new listing rules for firms that are financing carbon credit generating projects and looking to drive the growth of the market and increase its transparency. European Airlines, here, an NGO commissioned report found that they were using carbon credits of questionable environmental integrity and failing to provide enough transparency about their carbon credit practices. The Global Carbon Council, here's another issuance, doubling their issuance so far this year. And finally, looking at the voluntary carbon market, still is underpinned by thin liquidity and negative press about the integrity in the market. So integrity, back to the issue about fraud, and really the question of transparency and integrity, both on the buyer and seller sides, are really what's needed. And so it all does come back to sustainability data, and ensuring that we're collecting the data and the evidence to back it up. So we've got proper provenance in that data from our suppliers, as well as in our own organizations, and making sure that that's transparent and shareable to all of our stakeholders in our transitions to net zero. So with that, I hope that was helpful. A bit of a journey piecing together the marketplace, business responses, some of the regulatory drivers, and some of the things that means for procurement and supply chain. I'm afraid there is no silver bullet, but there's a lot of fascinating change taking place out there, interesting tool sets to use, clean tech technologies to help in the abatement and avoidance space. and mechanisms like open source supplier contract agreements and language, again, to move us all collectively in the right direction. So with that, I'll open it up to any further questions.
All right, folks, I know that we had a couple of questions in the beginning here, and we answered some on the fly. Do you have any questions for Matthew? Give them a couple of seconds here. I know I have a couple. And I really like the fact that what was the program in the UK, the Chancery Lane?
The Chancery Lane project.
That's very cool, and I think it's important to speak the same language, right? So if we're putting different clauses into our contracts to different vendors, people need to understand. To one of your other comments, it's a kind of a cowboy environment right now around carbon in general. Trying not to offset stuff. We're trying to reduce carbon, right, more than anything else. So there's a question that just came in, so let's go to this. How much does organic farming transformation can help in carbon management? It's a great question.
It is a great question, and we're seeing some really exciting innovations in that space and investment in that space. I don't have any numbers for the value that can add, but we've seen that that portion of agricultural land use is over 12% of overall carbon footprint. Now, some of the initiatives that we've been seeing are programs that are working with farmers. In this particular case, farmers across wider Europe, and particularly at large-scale agricultural operations with cash crops, a range of cash crops, but what they're doing is taking science-based methods to evaluate soil, and of course, so on the science-based methods, let me just focus on this for a second. In the voluntary carbon market space, there are various certification bodies: Verra, Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, and these are based on some quite rigorous science-based methodologies for quantifying their impact, their carbon removal impact, and for the annual audit and review, or typically the annual audit and review of the sequestration of the project that the project has made. Now, so science-based methods being applied here are absolutely critical, but it's exciting to see scientists and universities working directly with farmers and in the agricultural community to teach them crop rotation practices, to work with them on how to improve the carbon sequestration of their agricultural lands, at the same time getting the co-benefits around biodiversity improvement. And that same program has actually recently purchased a UK satellite technology, which uses low-level satellites and imaging to further validate and measure the effectiveness of these projects. Sorry, a bit of a rant there, but it's a really exciting space, and regenerative agriculture and changing agricultural practices on a large scale in America, well, in the Northern Hemisphere, agricultural communities is huge, but also really exciting projects are happening in Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia and Africa, which are helping small subsistence farmers, improving livelihoods, while at the same time restoring forest lands, changing ag practices. So it's just a really exciting space, and it's a very important one.
We have another question here from Sarah Matthew. How do you solve the interoperability challenge in terms of using different chain protocols that we have in reality in the supply chain process? And how do you ensure the credibility of the data delivered? That's a big question right there. In this case, you need trust in the data before you go to the blockchain or DLT, which kind of goes back to the comment you just had, right, around science and being able to prove things.
Indeed, and those are great and very large questions. We could have an entire session on themselves. But first of all, very quickly to speak to the interoperability question. First of all, it's important to remember that blockchains very often have a very small data payload. There is not very much information that you can actually write into a block in a blockchain. So much of the data that we need to capture, report, and manage it does have to be stored securely off-chain. Now, some of the tools that we have, and I'll be happy to talk to anyone about our chain agnostic tools where we're able to monitor changes of state in complex data sets and write those to chain on any public, any blockchain protocol. And also what we call a block access protocol, more information on our website, how we manage to transmit and work with sensitive private data in a public blockchain context. And so, so we have tools that we can deploy in managing that interoperability. Verification of data and that trust, ensuring that trust in data. I've got a video on how we approach trust, and simply put, step one, you need to have data. So provide the data. That's fine. That doesn't give me very much trust, and I don't have very much knowledge if you're just reporting me your facts. So I need evidence. So the next layer of trust and knowledge comes from, well, where did these come from? Show me your calculations. Show me your policies. Show me the evidence behind this reported data. Moving beyond that comes, well, now I want to make sure that we've had an audit or assurance over this from an independent party. So audit and assurance layer is another important layer and to have evidence of that being supplied gives us that much more knowledge and trust in the data. But that's often still not enough. And what we are enabling companies to do is to provide yet another layer of trust beyond that, which is completely independent open source data to monitor material risks, material change, and material data points that are being reported. And the perfect example is satellite imaging and monitoring different greenhouse gas emissions from a manufacturing facility, or monitoring, like the example I just used, the calculation of the agriculture ag-regeneration that for the carbon sequestration in agricultural lands, and using satellite imaging there. That is completely independent from what the farmer's reporting, from what the or evidencing, and what the auditors are providing. So there are different layers. We think about building trust in data with a variety of layers and equipping people to build trust in their own reported data. And I hope that helps to answer the question. Yeah.
Indeed, it does for me. Can we please, yes, we will send over the presentation and the recording to this video. Let me ask you this. What are the biggest risks to organization when it comes to reporting, to sustainable reporting?
That's a really good question, and I've got to bring it back to the earlier question about fraud, carbon fraud, and also, so we all know, those who have been in business for years recognize that regulatory change, it's one thing to have a regulation in place, and it's a very different one to have regulators with teeth actually taking action and enforcing. So we are, I believe, some way from having truly enforceable regulation. However, we are right in the beginning of the storm for litigation. And so we're seeing cases being brought forward, litigation against companies, litigation against countries. Let's see, so Australia, one of the islands off Australia, has just won a UN human rights court case against the country of Australia for their role in climate destruction that has eroded their lands and affected their livelihoods. That's a very large scale a population suing a nation. But time after time, you see greenwashing litigation being brought to the courts for corporates, and that's something that gets boardrooms sat up straight in their chairs. So the biggest risks are, and it doesn't even have to be intentional, but being caught out or accused of greenwashing, and so that is just something to be very mindful of, both in the data that you're collecting and trusting from your suppliers, to that which you are assembling and presenting to your investors and to the regulators, and to customers. So it's mindful of the greenwashing threats that are being posed there, and really it does come back to this importance of providing the transparency about the purchasing company to the credit, and the transparency about the credit to the buyer. And what I mean by that, we're doing work where we are evaluating not just whether or not a credit project is verified, but we're looking at their governance structure, their risk and control environment, thinking about their longevity, and are they going to be there for future credit purchases. We're looking at their controls frameworks, and really taking a much more holistic due diligence view on the carbon projects to make sure that they're appropriate for the buyer. So a lot of different things to consider as you pay attention to greenwashing.
And case in point to that greenwashing, last week in the news here, at least in Canada, we had some articles about a power company in the UK that was burning wood pellets that they said were sustainable in their processes, but when they actually looked into it, or when people looked into it, they found forests in British Columbia being cut down to furnish those wood pellets, right? So not very sustainable, if you ask me.
Oh, indeed, that's an interesting one, and another example of the greenwashing is the threat that is in renewable energy. And so for solar and wind projects that are generating renewable energy, they're able to get certifications of renewable energy credits. Now, those are often sold completely separate from the energy, because the energy goes straight into the electricity grid. So those certifications go into the open market, and they're bought by anyone and to apply to their use of electricity. And that's no longer it's very much frowned upon, because and there is a need to start keeping the certification closer to the electron. Now, while that is impossible, there are many things that can be done to keep that, to keep the certification closer to the electrons. But there's a lot of really fascinating challenges out there to overcome, and yeah, it's an amazing space.
People are talking about it much more these days, which is encouraging.
Yes, indeed.
Do we have any more questions? move this screen over. Thinking about small organizations, right? So yes, we have the corporates, we have the big people that have resources, that have staff to look at this. You have a lot of new, ESG related positions that are being created. But how do you help maybe your providers, your suppliers that are maybe a bit smaller without burdening them with all this regulatory stuff, right?
No, absolutely, and that's such an important question. There's, and I think, I mean, you kind of come back to the opportunity to use different technologies to simplify the process. And now that's there are challenges because a lot of these reporting frameworks that the companies are being asked to report to often don't even get really specific about the KPIs and the data points that are really required. They're still at fairly high level principle basis. But I would say if you think about the business activities that those companies are carrying out, and look at ways to well, that's the starter for the conversation. What sits in your supplier's agreement? What products and services are they providing? Okay, what's the carbon intensity? And this is just first principles, basic logic. Doesn't have to be quantified with models and expensive consultants. But just thinking about what does their footprint look like as they carry out their business to provide you with a product or service? And almost using business activities as a framework, and we've done some work to simplify the EU taxonomy regulation, and so that's just starting with basic frameworks and starting with the activities that they're carrying out, and it's just kind of first principles. I mean, we've been involved with a logistics company in the Netherlands that does haulage around the Benelux region. For every truckload that they carry, they're planting a tree. And so, and that's their message. That's their doing their bit, as it were. And so it's amazing the grassroots activities that people are carrying out just to make a difference, and so it's exciting, right? And other businesses where they're looking at literally wrapping their product with a carbon credit of a few kilos, and allowing customers to buy a product, not just donate to an offset or to a project, but actually to say, I purchased along with this product a certain offset, and here's my story. And it's exciting, and it doesn't require rocket science, or expensive consultants, but it's just a range of different very practical, pragmatic ways of thinking, and starting the conversation and seeing where that goes.
If we don't ask the questions, right?
Yeah.
All right, Matthew, we're on top of the hour. Thank you very much. Very insightful. I look forward to sending those slides. We've had a lot of questions, or a lot of requests for the slides, so thank you again. And if people want to contact you, how would they go about and do that?
Absolutely. So our website is arivu.io. My email is Matthew with 2 T's .nelson@arivu.io, or you can look us up on LinkedIn. We'll send those links through with the slides. I'll put my contact details, and the slides we'll distribute as well. So would love to hear from anyone. It's just an extraordinary marketplace and journey that we're all on, and a lot of positive momentum. So pleased to hear from anyone.
And still a lot of work to be done still.
That there is.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time today. Again, we'll send out the slides and the link to the YouTube recording probably within a couple of days. And we hope you enjoyed the session. So enjoy the rest of your day and see you in the next one.